right. Welcome to the Agile Leadership Spotlight, Understanding Human Systems Dynamics. I think that's right. Thriving in Complexity is the title of our show today, and our guests are Glenda Eoyang and Royce Holladay. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Glenda and Royce are, what can I say? Well, they have been my teachers. I believe they're still my teachers because I was lucky going through their program over the past few months. One of the programs, I think there's a multitude of possibilities to learn. And talking human systems dynamics, this is an institute, and you're the founders or co-founders, and I think there are more founders of it. Yeah, and you're offering a lot of interesting things around that. But maybe let's get started first of all with a short introduction, and I would just let you introduce yourself. Whoever wants to go first.
Royce, why don't you start?
I was fixing to say that to you. So, my name is Royce Holladay, and I've been working with Glenda in human systems dynamics since around 2000. And before that, as she was developing the concepts and ideas. In my background, I'm an educator, public educator here in the United States. I was a classroom teacher and a school counselor and administrator. And in about 2000, as Glenda was moving into and began thinking about the Institute, I was leaving public education to do some independent work. And so since then, we've been working together. Full transparency, I think it's only fair to let you know that if you think we look alike, there's a reason. We're sisters. So we've been working and thinking about ideas much of our lives. And this is one that has really engaged us and we believe has a lot of promise for engaging lots of folks as we continue to move into these times that are so uncertain. I write. I love doing the work. I love training people. I'm a mom. I have 2 grown daughters and a 15-year-old granddaughter. So that's who I am. Glenda, how about you?
Well, so we're really happy to be here, Mike, and it's been fun to learn with you over these months. My background was in history and philosophy of science, and I got fascinated really early with paradigm shifts. And so each of them throughout the history of science was just really fascinating to me. So I was shocked in about 1986, 87, when I realized the need for a paradigm shift for myself and my business. So I was running a technical training and documentation company in 86, and it became really clear that the way I used to do work was not going to work, that the kind of waterfall methodologies, carefully planned, um, under control, engineering-based models simply were not going to be, if we can say, agile enough for the work that needed to be done. And it was at that point that I began to look for alternative management models and found none in the management literature, leadership literature. But I did find a really interesting paradigm shift in the physical sciences and mathematics world in the form of chaos and complexity sciences, nonlinear dynamics. And so I started in the late 1980s drawing lessons from those sciences in a fairly eclectic way from lots of different nonlinear sciences to try to see what was happening in human systems, to understand it in ways that were useful, and then to take action. So one of my early frustrations with complexity scientists was they talked a lot about describing what they saw in retrospect. So they could say, oh, that's what happened then, and they could describe it. But I was in business. I needed to make decisions and take action in the moment. And so the idea of finding intelligence to inform action became really central to the work that later became human systems dynamics. So we have a network of about 900 associates who studied as you have, Mike, and each one has a unique flavor in application because our work really blossoms in practice. So the theory is interesting, the tools are simple, that the place where it really lands and grows is in practice. So each of those 900 people in their various fields and perspectives have really shaped HSD to be useful and true in their own environments. So that includes agilists, it includes educators, healthcare, public health, government, political advocacy, international development, many, many fields. So we're just really happy to be with you today and curious about what your community is curious about as we think about complexity and how it inspires action.
That's beautiful. So thanks for your introduction. It was really, really nice to hear this broad spectrum. And for everyone, by the way, a little bit of householding or housekeeping. For those who are live here, just feel free to drop us your questions whenever something could be interesting for you to dive into. We're happily pulling it in when it fits our context. And for the beginning, talking complexity is obviously, something very, very closely attached to agile ways of working. That's number one. And many of us are familiar with the term, with a couple of tools. And still in practice, I think we still struggle to understand what to do, what to actually do differently, and what difference actually would mean, and how to cope with uncertainty. I think that's already a little bit of a starter conversation. And I'm even not yet talking about the possible limitation of a box we're in, right? Because we're now living in a global world, and everybody of us just recognized how that fits together. But how does HST and there's this human factor in this word. Basically, what does it bring us to the table to basically become more aware of, or more capable of making decisions, more aware of situations, making decisions?
There are three basic tools that we use. Royce, do you want to talk about those three kind of core central HSD tools for action?
Sure. One of them is just understanding that human behavior is about patterns. What do you observe over time? What are the essential ways you would describe a situation or a group of people or their work together? What you're really naming is patterns. They cooperate well, or they communicate well, or they don't, or they conflict, right? And so what you're describing are the patterns of their interaction. And so in HSD, what we focus on is how do we identify and name those patterns in ways that help us shift them. Do we have a pattern that's really working and we want to amplify it? Or do we have a pattern that's not working so well and we want to damp it or ignore it, make it go away? One of the tools that we use to do that is inquiry. We talk about standing in inquiry. And yes, it means asking questions, but we've refined it into a series of practices so that you can really think about, if I'm in this situation, if this is what's going on, what is it I need to shift that to? Let me give you an example. One of the practices is to turn judgment into curiosity. And if I'm judging something, then my assumptions are set. I am standing in a place where this person is right or this person is wrong based on how their assumptions compare to mine. And you get into that place where you really can't see anything new. I assume this group is going to be this way, and so that's what I see when I'm there. It's observation bias. And so when we talk about turning judgment into curiosity, what we're really talking about is when I catch myself in that place, or very often when Glenda catches me in that place, she will say to me, so where's the question in that, Royce? What question could you ask? I can remind myself of that. I remind her of that. So if I can shift from, I am assuming that this is going on because blah, 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 then I can say, what do I see that tells me what triggered that? What do I see that could help me understand this better? So I'm turning it to judgment into curiosity. Another one is turning disagreement into shared exploration. because when you're disagreeing with somebody, you're basically nose to nose with them. You're giving your stance, you're giving their stance, and all you can see is how wrong they are. All they can see is how wrong you are. But if you take that disagreement and turn it into a shared exploration, then what you're doing is you're not nose to nose anymore. You're standing side by side, looking at that thing that is a disagreement, saying, where could we go with that? What is in that disagreement to shared exploration? And the third one is this one's really hard for me, turning defensiveness, my own personal defensiveness, into reflection. Why is that pushing my buttons? What's causing that cold pit of belly here? What's making me want to defend or run away or ignore or strike out? And so if I can stop and interrupt that by asking myself, what is that about? I can see that pattern, see it in a way that helps me know something I can do, as Glenda was saying, and helps me move forward from there. And then the final one is taking my assumptions, which I talked about with judgment, and turning them into questions, right? So we use patterns, we use inquiry, and then we use a process called adaptive action. And if anybody's heard of HSD, they have probably heard of and remember adaptive action first. And it is a 3-step iterative cycle of saying what's going on. So what meaning can I make of that? And how does that inform my next wise or next informed action? And so if I can see and name the patterns that I'm seeing, the what part, then I can step into the so what part of the cycle and say, so what if that continues? So what if I turn that into a question? So what assumptions do I have that I need to shift into questions? Then that informs me in my next wise action. And so I might go back, and my next wise action may be as simple as go ask some questions with the people I was observing or the patterns I was observing.
Right.
And the understanding that adaptive action, then once you've done something, you can step back into it and say, well, what's my next what? What was the impact of that? And I bring with me in that cycle what I learned in the cycle before, and the cycle before that, and the cycle before that. And an adaptive action can be in the length of a heartbeat. When you're driving home and you see the brake lights in front of you piling up, and there's red lights in front of you, you in an instant you say, I either need to turn on my brakes or get off this street, right? And so you respond. There's a pattern, you make sense of it, and you respond that quickly. On the other hand, there may be some that last longer or that take a different track, or I have to go back, cycle back through several times.
Right.
So those are kind of our 3 basic pieces. Glenda, what would you add to any of that?
Well, it's really fun to hear you talk about adaptive action in this context. Michael Spade and I are starting a program next week that we're calling the Dragons, and it's about sense making in complexity. That it's so easy to get stuck in sense making with your assumptions and your judgments and whatever conflicts you have. You just get stuck, and so you can't get enough flexibility to see something anew. And so Michael and I are going to do an 8-week program about sense making using HSD patterns in the way that it really challenges fundamental assumptions about how things are supposed to work. The other thing, we've got lots of friends in Agile. When Diana Larson came through the certification training oh my gosh, maybe 10 years ago, she was in the process of writing her liftoff book.
All right.
And so she would, it was so funny. So she'd come to a day and then she'd run upstairs. This was back in the old face-to-face days. She'd run upstairs and rewrite a chapter, and then she'd come back down the next day. And it was so much fun to see how patterns beginning and also retrospectives using these 3: inquiry, adaptive action, and pattern logic in reflection, at the ends of projects. And Enrico Tiotti, you may know Enrico, runs a series of programs on retrospectives using HSD tools. So they fit so nicely with the practices and disciplines of Agile. And we've learned a
Mm,
lot from folks who have Agile experience. So,
Right, right. Yeah, I was
yeah.
just thinking about this. I was just thinking about this because the adaptive action cycle, in the agile space, probably most people would recognize as inspected adapt cycles. This typical,
Hmm.
gaining insights, and then taking action. But what is very often missing in reality or in practice is this sense making piece. So, like, all right, we have formats for inspecting, like exploring what artifacts do we have, how do they look like. But very often it's the artifacts we look at, patterns on the wall, but not patterns on behavior.
Yeah.
And that actually would, bring us potentially into the situation of saying, hey, what is my patterns? How do I behave, and how do I influence, and how do I interrelate with what is actually happening? And that brings me actually to this initial piece, because when you talked about the four principles before, Royce, which is the standing in inquiry, right? It's this sort of, that's the bracket, standing in inquiry.
Hmm.
I mean, just as you said, turning defensiveness into self-reflection actually requires self-reflection. So
yeah.
that's a little bit of a catch-22, right? It's very easy to say, hey, be a better person, right? Instead of being a bad person.
Exactly.
But how do you be a better person? Like, how can I get away from judgment? How can I get away from disagreement, or literally saying, hey, I fight my way through here? Or finally, who cares about my assumptions when I'm right anyway? So the question is, and from this perspective, number one, I recognize HSD from this perspective as a sort of a leadership stance or leadership approach. And
Hmm.
I'm very careful about leadership here, not saying this is a rank leadership or leadership by rank, but in terms of getting movement energy into a system.
Yeah.
How does that play out from your practice? And I think you have more than 20 years practice with HSD,
Hmm.
people you work with.
Uh, in HSD, because of the nature of the interconnectedness, everything in a complex system, right,
Exactly.
is connected, and we influence each other whether we mean to or not. And what the way we think about leadership is that anybody in a system can be a leader, right? Because what they're doing is that they are looking at the patterns around them, making sense of them in the context of where they stand, and taking their next informed action. And so, whether it is uh, your kids at home, as they grow, they're taking on more responsibility. They're looking at things. They come up to something they think they can do, and then they realize they can't. They come and say, "Dad, help me with this," or "How would you do this?" or whatever. And so, that in that moment, they're a leader in that family because they are, in fact, taking action to do something to improve either their own experience or the family life in an organization, in a community. The grassroots movements in more recent years of individuals and groups in the community taking action that's appropriate to their local space. And it's not everybody doing the same thing, but it's everybody moving toward a shared goal so that they are leaders in the spaces where they live and play.
Mm.
And so, as you said, it's not about leadership being a top down, uh, uh, supervisory or top of the heap consideration. We teach this and we use it in ways that look at leadership in that way.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, Royce, I think that's really great. And recognizing this first capacity of leadership is the recognition of the need to change. And so
Yeah.
often applications of HSD begin with a recognition of, oh, I'm stuck. What I'm doing isn't working. I need an alternative. And that is the moment at which people realize that their old assumptions, their old answers, their old levels of expertise, the work they used to do is just not cutting it anymore. And it's that moment that they turn to HSD to look for alternative approaches. In fact, the very first contact we had with Agile was a group of people who had been active very early in the Agile community, and they realized two things. that they were stuck, that they individually and as a field were stuck, and they came to HSD. One was that they found that the software development community could be as agile as it wanted to, but if the business wasn't,
Right.
nothing was going to happen except just a lot of friction and
Right.
fire. And so they thought about HSD as a way to bring agility on the other side of that boundary into business decision making and product and leadership. The other way they saw that they were stuck was that these were people who'd been involved early in Agile when it was very emergent and flexible and adaptive, very agile, and they saw a shift in the field becoming less and less agile. And they wanted to find a way to reinvigorate the agility of Agile.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. We can take over. So there's always this problem with live interviews when we get stuck with our voice and need something to drink. I've been there too.
Yeah, excuse
So
me. Excuse me.
it's all live, so there is no cutting or like
Yeah,
editing.
that's fine.
But the
So
interest,
that's
please.
the trick, is to recognize that you're stuck and reach for
Yeah.
something different.
Right.
Wherever
That-
you are. Yeah.
That sounds like a typical entry point. Like, right, it's probably happening every day, everywhere in business nowadays. And Royce mentioned, I think that's an interesting point too, because when we say systems, we're obviously not talking IT systems. I mean, that's clear for everyone. We're talking about human systems, but any kind of human systems that can be part of the organization, that can be the whole organization, that can be my private life, that can be my family, that can be my friends, that can be my system of systems. So as we just experience it, right?
It can be you,
Right.
right?
Me and myself on my own.
You yourself and you. Yeah.
Yeah, systems inside systems. Yes, how I think, where I'm coming from, my history, my potential ideas for the future.
Exactly.
So the standing inquiry, I posted it here in the chat for everyone who wants to look at it. Again,
Good,
come up with
thanks.
your questions. They seem to be, first of all, a very powerful tool. I mean, first of all, it's principles or phrases, but you can use it as a tool for exploration, like to say, okay, what
Yeah.
does that mean for us, right? For a team of leaders or change agents or whoever, right?
Yeah,
Or the-
and even using them that way, you can think about, okay, I'm feeling judgment. Is
Right,
that the appropriate feeling?
right,
Right. So when I'm walking across the street with a 4-year-old, I'm in a judgment that they need to hold my hand. Right. And so judgment sometimes is the appropriate response to something. Defensiveness. If I am in danger, I need to see that defensiveness. If I am working with a group of people whom I oppose significantly, then I need to be clear about and ethical about the assumptions that I'm holding so that I'm not swaying all over the place, right? So you're really looking at a tool that helps you know what to do when you're realizing that you're in judgment and it's not working.
right.
But it also helps you think, yes, judgment may be the right thing here. And so it helps you to slide between that thing of, is judgment okay, or do I need to be curious? Because what we talk about is fit for function. What's going to help me? What's going to help the system writ large in the best way right now? What is it the system, whether it's me fitting with my family, whether it's my family fitting in the community, whether it's a community fitting in the more global space? What needs to happen here to find the best fit, the most resilient response, the most effective way of finding that space of being able to move forward, getting unstuck at that level?
Right.
And so, and we talked about these 3 tools. We have about, what, Glenda, 22 or 23 tools on the website. Some of them are original to us, and some of them are ones that we learned from other groups and said, well, this is this fits with an HSD stance. And so there are about 22 or 23 tools on the website. And one of the things that I want to say real quick here is, anything you find on our website, we want you to use it. And so consider that you have permission We just ask for two things. One, that you cite the source, so if somebody else wants to go find something, they can. And the other thing is, if you learn something from using it, teach it to somebody. Teach it back to us. Say, hey, I learned this using this tool, or teach it to others. Because the work that we do, as Glenda was saying, it works across so many different fields that we want all those different perspectives. And Glenda and the way I work, we can't know what happens in Agile. We are not leaders in Agile, but Agile people do, right? Or in education, or in healthcare, or public health, or in those various areas. They're the experts in those ways. And so how do people in those different fields use HSD in the moment to create action in their fields? We give them the tools for sense making, and most of those tools are about sense making, and they make sense in their own context.
Yeah, we just put the link here on the site, and I can just here on the screen, I can just invite everyone and recommend everyone to go there, because it's really a nice library where you can pull out information and guidance and everything, and it's beautiful, a beautiful library. Sorry, Glenda.
Lots of stuff.
It's really interesting, because I suspect that some of the listeners are familiar with liberating structures.
Right.
And it's interesting because the tools of liberating structures, and Keith and we have common roots way back. The liberating structures tools are great for holding dialogue and conversation. So they're really about discourse and structuring a dialogue. They're really lovely. And some of the tools we hold in common with them, and we use them to look across many different scales of the system and act in lots of different ways. And so it's just been really fun to have that ongoing dialogue with Keith.
Yeah.
One of the things I think that really makes HSD most powerful, particularly in VUCA times, in times of complexity, is that the same set of really simple tools can help you manage your own stress and anxiety, help a team come together to do work, help you engage with customers, to help you even do process improvement, to do strategy, to do larger community development. And so the same little set of tools can move all the way up and down the scales. So you don't really have time, or I don't have time when I'm in the middle of a complex challenge, to pause, like push the pause button and go do a systems dynamics model, or push the cut button and go do something else, or some kind of, there's just not that time. And so being able to have kind of a Swiss Army knife, quick and easy tools that can function any place at any time, really gives you a kind of agility in the moment that, boy, I don't know that we're going to be able to get through the next 5 years, next decades, without that kind of real agility, engagement, and creativity in a moment.
Right. So for those people who want to dive quickly into it, I mean, this is a link you cannot as such copy paste, obviously, but you can search for the book Adaptive Action on Amazon, or at your preferred bookstore, because this will immediately, and if it's an ebook, you can obviously read it today, start reading it today or right after, give you more detailed insight, and you might spend the next few hours or days with it to learn more about immediately what it's about, how it works, how it fits together. That's just a short teaser. Before we dive into maybe more of the application, I still want to come a little bit closer to, okay, how would that potentially look like? I would love to zoom out. Oh, by the way, that's again a zoom in, zoom out. It's one of the HSD terminology practices, working with systems, because Agile is here a little bit of our context, maybe not even of everybody's, because I don't know who's here. But I would like to ask you about typical applications in other fields, because I think that's so powerful. And again, when we say Agile, we love to talk nowadays about business agility. And again, it's way more than Agile methods. Everybody recognizes suddenly, oh, but we have a talent problem here because we're in a global world and people don't want to join anymore. And then there is a supply chain problem. And then there is even a market segment problem because people have not enough money anymore. And suddenly we recognize there is this systems of systems, and there are so many areas of possible application, and you've got so much
Right.
experience. Maybe tell us a little bit about what typical other fields there are.
Mhm.
Okay.
So a couple of quick stories, if I can, Royce, is that okay?
Yeah, of course, of course.
So we've been, over the last 3 years, working with people in China, particularly leaders of organization development. And OD is a relatively new field in China,
Wow.
and they're seeing real urgency for change, partly because global industries, and when I say China, I mean the PRC, in this situation. Um, they have global institutions that have local organizations. They have local organizations that are trying to shift. They're building technology quickly. They're really moving it into an entrepreneurial world. So the business frame in China was in radical transformation even before COVID. And certainly with COVID, it is really, really disrupted, even in ways we can't imagine in the West. So our colleagues there have been bringing business leaders together from across industries. So everything from an electric car designer manufacturer to a toothpaste distributor
Mm.
to a financial industry to schools, together in these leadership forums. And they bring their wicked issues with them. And so as they listen and watch the wicked issues, one of the things that's been particularly useful there is inquiry. The culture historically has been very hierarchical, very top down, very expert oriented. And introductions from the West have not helped that. They've really
Mhm.
brought even more. Now there's the international expert who's driving the work. And yet that doesn't work very well when you need to innovate and respond. And so the work that we've done with them has been mostly about, so how do you hold your expertise and stand in inquiry at the same time? How do
Mm.
you hold stable tradition and be able to innovate and explore? How do you hold the structure of the whole and also accommodate individual needs and expertise? And so that conversation across industries in China has been really interesting. So that's at a really broad scale.
Yeah.
At a more detailed scale, in a medical school in Michigan, we were teaching the top 3 layers of leadership in this medical school.
Mm.
And, one of the women came, she was very distracted during the class, and we said, "So what's up? What's happening?" And she said, "Well, I have to go have this really tough conversation, longtime employee in the company, and I have to fire her because she's not performing."
Mhm.
And we said, "Okay, well, that's a challenge." Then we talked about the rules for inquiry. And she said, "I wonder if I could fire her, go into this meeting with her, this troubled employee, in inquiry. What would that look like?" And so she did. She came back the next day and she said, "It was like magic." She said, "I went in and the question I asked was, 'How are you really being able to thrive in this job?'" And the woman said, "Well, I'm not. It's really miserable. What I really want to be doing is something, something, something else. Maybe I should quit." So this
Wow.
whole
Yeah.
conversation, the inquiry tipped it.
Yeah.
And then the third thing is I've spent the last week in British Columbia in Vancouver doing a training program for top healthcare leaders from across the province, 42 of them. And their goal is to build a network to create the future of healthcare in British Columbia. And workforce, as you mentioned, is one of their major issues. And so they're doing adaptive action, 3 different strategic groups saying, well, what if you look at the workforce issue through an individual stress and engagement perspective? What would that lead you to? What if you look at the workforce in terms of an educational preparation process? How would you intervene in schools throughout the system or region? Then the third is, how do you look at workforce in terms of process redesign so that you don't need as many
Mm.
registered nurses, so you don't need so many? What would that look like? And so over the next 8 months, 3 different teams are going to be engaging with adaptive action in workforce from those 3 very different systemic views. So those are just some examples. Royce, others you wanna
Right.
add, like practical applications?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking of this an entrepreneurial company that we're working with in Brazil, and it is a software development group they're creating an online platform of units and information for the K-12 schools, pre-K-12 actually. And so it's an organization that's made up of a demonstration school where the curriculum is being developed, the software developers who are designing and developing the software to meet the specs of the educators and what they want in the curriculum, and sales who are out in the public selling this across South America, moving into international sales. And we trained all of the kind of mid managers and above in HSD. And what they're seeing is that they are so much more coherent across the whole. When the schools are making recommendations about curriculum, then they're able to be clearer and speak the same language as the designers and the developers, and being clear about that process in a way that the people who sell it are learning what they can say to the people who are purchasing and what they can't say, what they can promise now and what they can't promise now. Even in the school, they're taking the conceptual pieces of HSD and moving it into instruction. We have an associate who has worked in teaching teachers for years and years and years. And she has taken HSD and begun to think about how do you use this kind of practice to inform your instruction on a day-to-day basis or your instructional planning. And so that's going on in the school. They're using it and blending HSD with their agile methods, as many of the folks online are. And then the administration and sales are using adaptive cycles to say, what can I say and what I can't say? What does this community need that this community doesn't have? Or when the community doesn't have, for instance, the connection that they need for internet, the high-powered internet, then what can they do and what can they support them in doing to do something about that? So you have one business that is actually about 4 different industries, and they're using it to be able to talk to each other, to strengthen their process, to strengthen their market, to strengthen their product.
Yeah.
And we have a colleague who uses HSD not in public education, but in educating medical folks, medical education. There's just that's why when we talk about HSD, we try to pick content that works for whatever crowd we're talking to, because you could just talk about the ideas writ large and here's adaptive action, here's this, but when you can put it in the context of the work people are actually doing, then they make sense of it on their own. So, for instance, we teach what we call adaptive action labs. Those are our workshops, and it is, you come and you're learning about, this next one is about resilience, or you're learning about HSD as a concept. And it's never just here are the ideas. It is what is it you're dealing with right now? What is the thing that you're challenged by right now? Then we do a little bit of teaching of a concept, and then we say, so how can you use this in your challenge? Right. How does it help you be a better leader, be a better parent? Last week we had one where the person was all about working on some family issues that were going on.
Right.
And so it's always in the context of what is the business.
Right. So that was beautiful. I mean, that was just a few examples out of probably hundreds, thousands. Because again, you're doing this work since years with many hundreds of practitioners across the globe. What I know, there is one format which is already recommendable. I think this one is free, right? Inquiry is the answer. I'm not sure if it's free, but at least I'm not sure if it's for everyone, but at least if you've gone through the courses, which literally applies a tool or a process. I think it's the power of questions, right? It sort of puts you in the position of dealing with questions around a wicked issue, by the way, which is another topic which we didn't define the term yet, and then lets anyone experience now online, and this is the nice thing about today's world, just have a short taste what this could look like. And there's another one which you mentioned, Royce, right? The Adaptive Action Lab, which these are events which are of larger scale, and here's one which you mentioned on October 18th. Yeah, around resilience. So if anybody's interested, here is the link, or a short link, and you will get then be pointed to the HSD website. So
yeah,
that's an opportunity to expose yourself, and just say, okay, I heard a lot about phrases now, but what is it? Here it is. You can try things.
exactly. And the power of questions is a really interesting
Right.
process, because it brings a wicked issue, and those are they really are the issues that challenge us, that emerge from the complexity in our lives, right? So life is so complex that I'm running into this thing and I get stuck because there's so many differences there. There's so many sources of the challenge. And if I pull a thread here, it's going to impact over there and over there and over there. And so a wicked issue is one that emerges from that kind of milieu of the complexity. And so it's so much fun. We never know who's going to show up. It's every morning at 10 o'clock Central Time in the U.S.
Right.
So that makes it about 5 o'clock for you, I think.
5 o'clock,
evening.
right? So people just missed it, but you can go there along tomorrow. And there is, again, under the event section on your website, there's a possibility to, I think, to find the possibility.
Glenda, do you want to put the link in?
I will indeed. And
it's free. Whoever shows up are the right people.
Right.
And sometimes we have as many as 12 or 13, and sometimes there are as few as 4 or 5. And one person says, well, I have a wicked issue. Right. And they ask the question, they state what their issue is, and then they sit back and just listen while everybody else in the room peppers them with questions. And sometimes it's never advice. We're not allowed to give it have you tried this? That's kind of advice. But to say, how is this like a fairy tale? If you were going to color this, what color would it be? And sometimes it's more concrete questions like, how do the people connect with each other? How do they get information? Who gets information first? What does this have to do with power in the system? So we go from metaphorical questions to very concrete questions, back to metaphorical, and every place in between. But we ask questions of that person for about 20 minutes, 18, 20 minutes. And then we spend the last 10 minutes of the session just sort of talking about it, where the person says, well, here's what I heard, and here's my next action. And then we just sort of talk about it. So it's 30 minutes every weekday, and it's amazing.
Sort of an application of standing in inquiry, right? What we said before. On the one hand side, it's helpful to stand in inquiry if you're there, and at the same time, it's sort of okay, this is about getting into curiosity, exploration. Also, how do I behave and react on certain things I hear, and so on and so forth. But the nice thing is, again, wicked issue, because obviously everybody approaching HSD will recognize, okay, this is about something that cannot be literally solved, right? It's, I'm giving an example where some people say agile transformation, which is a little bit of a buzzword nowadays, I would believe, but it's something which you cannot really grasp. You can't do it. You can't declare it done. Call it this way. You cannot say, now we're transformed. Next piece, right? And say, what's next on the agenda? And that's what many have to learn first after they went through a couple of painful weeks.
And that there are always patterns that you can shift.
Yeah.
But you will never solve it. Never solve it. And the link that I put in is to the website, where they'll see a description of the process and a link to all of the archives. So we've recorded all of the 650 inquiry is the answer sessions, power question sessions, and the questions, and a link to be able to register. So we have one colleague who runs the recordings in the background of all the questions, people asking questions while she's working. And she says that's what makes her a really good agilist is that she gets better and better questions all the time just by listening to these
Right.
random deep
Yeah.
questions. So
Right.
that's the link that I put in.
Right.
We
Right.
started it in March of 2020 to give
Cool.
people a way to engage with each other during COVID, and it
Right.
just keeps on keeping on. One of the stories there, a colleague of ours in South Africa, her wicked issue was that she was an agile practitioner, was trying to be online, and she kept having blackouts that the electricity would go off, and she couldn't keep her computer charged well enough. And so it was just so frustrating. How do I work with periodic blackouts? And so in the process of the questioning, one of the questions was, well, when is it good for you not to have electricity? When do you appreciate that? And so at the end, she said, when I go on vacation, I unplug. So what if I think about every blackout as a mini vacation? I don't know when it's going to happen or how, but what if I treat it that way? What would that do to my
Exactly.
productivity? And
Yeah.
she found
Yeah.
that really a different way of making sense
Right.
of the situation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So now
And
this is
I wanted, Mike, I'm sorry, I just want to share one other very concrete way. So when the war in Ukraine broke out, we were in the middle of a cohort.
right.
And there was a woman from Ukraine who was on a bit of a sabbatical and went back as the war was breaking out because she needed to, be with her son and take care of things there. And she ended up on the western boundary of the country, helping refugees as they
In
left.
Ukraine, right?
In Ukraine,
Yeah.
yes.
Wow. Yeah.
And she had been in the course, and she realized one day that it was just nothing was working. It was all chaotic. And so she began using adaptive action. She would look around and she'd say, okay, what's happening right now? Where can I provide the best help? What can I do to help? And then that's what she would do. And then she'd say, what was the impact of that? And start in the next iteration. Well, the people around her started noticing that wherever she went, things calmed. People found their ways through the chaos of it, and people got unstuck. They could figure out what to do. And so they started asking her what that was about. And she was telling them, she basically was telling them about HSD.
Right.
And then several of them came to the next adaptive action lab that Glenda did on planning. And what was it, Glenda? 33 Ukrainians showed up to talk about this so that they could get a better understanding of what it was that Natalia was doing. And so that's another way that on the ground in a system of great complexity and danger, and nobody knows what tomorrow's going to bring, that
Right.
she was able to use what the little bit that she knew about HSD to begin to bring some calm to that, to be able to settle some patterns in the work that they did together.
Right. Right. That's amazing. Yeah, it's such an amazing field of application. And again, whether we zoom in or out, it's all connected, and there's always this same potential. It's like in a fractal way to apply the same concepts on every level, and then this triggers again some action somewhere else or influences somewhere else. And if we would zoom in again and think about talking patterns. If we were now a group of leaders, change agents, whatever we call ourselves, in the midst of a change program, a complex one, of an organization, and we face now standing in inquiry, that's probably already helpful to understand, hey, there is something behind getting away from right judgment, disagreement, and all this stuff. How would we recognize patterns and then basically start dealing with? I mean, just giving a little bit of a basic idea how that can look like.
Well, I'll say a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to Glenda. But for example, often as a consultant, we get called in and they say, we have such bad communication here. And so they're naming a huge, broad pattern that communication. Okay, just communicate better. That's the only answer you have when that is.
Yeah.
But if we can begin to ask questions, when do you communicate best? Who is connected to whom, and how often do you connect? And what does that connection look like? And so we have a tool that's called Pattern Spotters, for instance.
Exactly.
And you can find it on the website. And it's just a series of sentence stems that say, well, in general, this is what I'm seeing here. In general, what is it about your communication that's not working? And then you say, okay, what are the contradictions? You tell me that sometimes this happens, but when does it not happen? And another piece of it is, what surprises you? When are you surprised by how the communication works or it doesn't work? Because then you're being able to get more deeply into the complex nature of communication in an organization, for instance. And so using the pattern spotters, for instance, so we have tools that help you not just say what's wrong with this pattern, but get to a point where you're understanding more deeply in the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Glenda, what would you add?
With those tools, that's really great. And I love that tool. It's kind of a multi-use tool. All of our 23 to 25 are what we call mid-level abstractions. They're kind of concrete, applicable, pull out of your pocket and use tools. But they work because of the theory of pattern logic, which I discovered as I was working late in the 1990s. My question was, human systems self-organize, and sometimes they do it really smoothly and well, and sometimes they're a mess, and sometimes they're a mess until suddenly they organize. So I had watched teams and systems work in that way. And my question was, what is the mechanism? What are the conditions that influence how quickly and how clearly human systems, complex systems self-organize? And in looking at many different nonlinear sciences, I discovered that there were 3 conditions. And those conditions we now use to help us see what's happening in a complex system. We also use it to influence our action in the complex system. And those 3 things are, something's got to bound it. There's got to be some kind of a container, have to be some kinds of differences, or the system just dies, and they have to be connected. And so those are the 3 characteristics of complex systems that when we talk about pattern in a more kind of analytical, theoretical foundation, we can talk about what are the C's, containers, and D's, differences and exchanges, and how can we shift those to shift the pattern. So that's kind of the customized intervention end, but there are also off-the-shelf tools like the pattern spotters and others that allow you to work with the patterns directly.
Yeah.
Right. I just put the link for it, not the link, the information about the CD model. You know, where, I think your PhD was about that, right? If I'm
It was,
correctly informed.
and it's fascinating. About every week, I get a note that some number of people have downloaded and read my dissertation.
Yeah.
I wrote it in 2001, and still,
Wow.
like, every week there are 4 or 5 people who download it to read it. If I'd known that many people were reading it, I would have been more careful about how I wrote it. I assumed, you read a
No,
dissertation, it goes on the
it
shelf.
is.
For goodness
It
sake.
is interesting. It's, you know, the CDE model is still referred to many times in the Agile community for those who deal a little bit with self-organization to explain it. But what we are very often missing is then the so what, right? This sort of, okay, what can I do now? You know, there is this idea of, okay, there are patterns you can identify, can basically shift or shape patterns. That is not so well known, and this is obviously the practice we're trying to introduce here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
That
And
gives you the difference that Glenda talked about in her introduction, the difference between just describing what's going on out there
yeah,
or being able to take action to
yeah,
influence what's going on out there.
right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I pointed already to, I think the one event in October. There is another one where you can learn about HST for everybody who's interested on November 15th and 17th. I can only recommend this to everyone who is working in a, you know, what they would call themselves a complex environment, where they would say, oh, it's not as easy just to apply a few tools, frameworks, and sticky notes, but this kind of dynamics we experience, they're not controllable. So what shall I do? How can we become more skillful, right? I think that was the title of our show today. In a bit better informed and then more skillful in navigating this kind of messiness, and then finally figure out ways out of the messiness. Well, it's still complex,
Yeah.
but right. And sorry, go ahead, Royce.
No, I was just, thanks for putting that up. Just and it is really the basics. It's just an introduction. 6 hours of you bring your wicked issue, and it's being introduced to HSD in these various pieces that we're talking about today. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as I experienced your course, which is now available online, but gratefully coming back on site too, because obviously the past 15 years or so, or 17 years, you did that on site, which I was not able yet to experience, maybe in the future. And I think we have some idea next year to do even an event, which some people might be interested, something like an open space conference. Everything open, still open and under consideration, but at least the online format was really intense, because it's not just, sitting there for a few hours and consuming stuff, but it's really intense, long sessions. First of all, as a ramp up, but that's already a lot. And then going through a couple of weeks of self-application. This is obviously the helpful thing here, to say, hey, here is my wicked issue, whatever it is, right? Business, private, or combined, and then start actually applying and see how you learn about that.
And that's the what you went through in the certification, becoming an HSD associate, is that more intense, right? And the one that you just advertised about is a much less intense, but it says, it gives you a chance to say, so am I really interested in going to the next one? Right. And so it's a ramp up to that. Yeah.
Right. It is a complex topic. So that's, I think, that first challenging. And that might be the reason why, apart from Soya and Olivier, we didn't have questions. I mean, it was just hellos, right? So I still hope, and I assume we gave some value to everybody who listened, because we're close to the end here, close to the hour. But maybe for the end, Glenda, you mentioned it already. Michael Spade, by the way, is a known person in the Agile space. He's we call him one of the I can't say founders, initiators of the term Agile coaching, right? Making it more tangible. What are your next steps? What is coming next with HSD? People could, keep an eye open for, apart from what we already said. What are you working on next with HSD? Let's just give you a little bit of an outlook.
Yeah, this idea about there be dragons, there's some fundamental assumptions that we make that are different about the way reality works, the way human systems work, some really basic underlying assumptions. And that's the work that Michael and I and Marie Murdoch, who works with him, have been looking at. So we're really excited about that. And by looking at them from an HSD perspective and him from the integral Agile perspective, it's just been a really generative conversation we're really excited about. And you mentioned how happy we are to be back face to face in the certification training. So the last week of November, we'll be in the UK doing a face-to-face patterns and possibilities, and then the 4 months of online work. So that will be really exciting. We are concerned about the state of politics and supply chains and work and climate change and social disruption and violence. And so we are focusing on global issues with clients and in our community. And we're really concerned about the existential global issues that we'll be facing. And so we're turning toward those. We've mostly not engaged with those larger global systemic existential issues, but we think it's time to do that now. So that's another direction that we're expanding in HSD.
That's beautiful. Beautiful. And I can only recommend everyone doing similar things. Look beyond your, Agile practice. Probably everybody does, because first of all, everybody looks after their families and private life, and suddenly we recognize, oh, what's coming next, right? Pandemic is again hitting on the wall somewhere. It's so many topics, and in order to stay sane, which is, I think, the precondition to stand in inquiry, we can only benefit from approaches like this. And number two, we can only benefit from reaching out for each other and collaborating on these topics in a skillful way. I think these are the key words. And here are two ladies you can reach out for their work, what they're doing, how they're doing things, and learn from. And I think that can only enrich everybody's day-to-day life and business and whatever you are after for your future.
Yeah. And
Well,
we're only an email away. info@hsdinstitute.org. We look at those every day and we respond. So if people have questions or want to know more, that's beyond even what's on the website, let us know.
Putting that here in the comments too for those who are.
Okay, great.
Well, actually, I think the replay even allows to look at the chat. So whenever you watch this video, you will see still the chat. So Glenda and Royce, it was a real pleasure having had you here on the show. And there's certainly more to explore deeper, but hopefully everybody got a little bit of an introduction, what you're doing, how you're doing things, and what that could look like. And you offered a lot of material, wealth of material for people to continue with. So thanks for your work. Thanks for what you're doing for the world. And thanks for having joined here.
Well, thanks for inviting us. It was delightful.
Thanks.
And for everybody else who was listening, who is still watching this video, thanks for joining. And come back next time and have a lot of insightful experiences with this material with HSD. And we'd love to hear from you, whatever it is, whatever your stories are about. Thank you, and bye-bye.
All right.